Welcome again to Mental Health Moments. The subject that we are dealing with this time is the second part and one of the most requested topics that we've had, suicide. In our first video, we opened up the discussion and shared a few thoughts. Tonight, we're going to go a little bit deeper, and we hope that you're able to stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Welcome once again, and we're glad that you're here along with us. As we did last time, we understand that this is a very challenging topic to deal with, and so we want to encourage you at the very beginning that if any time during this session together becomes a little overwhelming, feel free to just pause and collect your thoughts and then come back. Now, last time together, we talked about the realities of suicide and the numbers that are increasing and how it's affecting more and more people in our society. And what we find encouraging is that now we're seeing that people are paying more attention. Members of the clergy and members of the mental health communities are all focusing a lot more attention on this. And thankfully, the stigma is beginning to go backwards a little bit so that now people are feeling freer to talk about their challenges. And people like you and me can have discussions like this. And we think that it's helpful. I think that one of the most important thoughts that I can share with you is that suicide is often preventable. Not always, but most often it can. And there are many thoughts to pull together when you talk about that. The first is a thought that I shared last time, that if someone is determined to complete the act of suicide, you may or may not be able to do much to stop them because so many times it's done in private and there is no indication that something is about to happen. It's kept very private and you can't even see it. The decision was completely theirs. What so many people told me is that the person that was contemplating suicide reached out. They reached out a couple of times, but then they just kind of withdrew. And they withdrew into themselves and they isolated themselves. And so I feel that the one thing that we need to do in this video is to be aware of the risk factors. There are definite risk factors, things that you can be aware of, things that you can see that are noticeable. So I hope that this will be helpful for us to pass along. Risk factors for suicide include, but they are not limited to, a personal history of mental illness, especially with disorders such as bipolar or schizophrenia. So if you have a friend or a family member who has had a history of mental illness and they have specifically been diagnosed with bipolar or schizophrenia, that's a risk factor. It's important for you to pay attention to that whenever someone has a history of depression or depressive behaviors. Depression is, listen, the most common factor associated with suicide or suicidal ideations. It is the number one risk factor. So if you have a friend or a family member who struggles with depression, you might want to be aware of that. Substance abuse problems. It's interesting to me to note that substance abuse is the second most common factor. So if depression is the very first risk factor, then substance abuse. And so what that means is that if you see someone drifting off into self-medication or more and more substance abuse, it's a risk factor to be aware of. Chronic pain, physical illness, or trauma. And we know that we have many family members and friends that deal with chronic pain, and it's a risk factor. Prolonged stress, bullying, or relationship problems. Sometimes we kind of overlook those things, but they are very real. If someone is dealing with bullying at school or at work, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's just for teenagers or children. Relationship issues. When people have relationships and those relationships don't go where they thought they would, it's a risk factor. Aging and declining function is very much a risk factor for suicide. Disability, family discord, or loss. Whenever someone has a history of suicide or social isolation, some of the most heartbreaking stories that I heard in the last video together was about entire sides of families completing suicide. One young lady sent me a private note, that her husband, her father, and her son had all completed suicide. And it's just some of the saddest things that you can hear. Another risk factor is when someone has previous suicide attempts. Sometimes we think that people are just looking for attention, and that's not always the case. Sometimes they're very serious about it. And one young lady that I spoke with this last week said that her husband finally completed the act of suicide on his 8th attempt. And so on the 8th attempt, it was just as serious as it was on the very first attempt. Please pay attention to those risk factors. Job loss or financial problems. Especially in our culture, in our world today, when someone loses a job, take that very seriously because it is a risk factor. Impulsive behaviors and tendencies, when someone suddenly starts behaving in a way that you're not used to seeing them behave, it is a risk factor in older people. Dementia and other forms of impaired cognitive ability have been linked to suicide and suicidal behavior. So, what can we personally do to help reduce the risks of suicide in people that we care about and indeed even in ourselves? One of the most important things that we can do, hear this, is listen. Just listen. Pay attention to them when they talk. And if you hear things coming out of their mouth as they talk about feeling hopeless or helpless or being a burden to people, if they constantly bring up the fact that they feel like they have no purpose in life, no real reason for living, and pay attention for that. If someone constantly speaks about pain or loss in their life, it's a risk factor. We should be listening. Pay attention to their behavior. If you notice that someone that you care about suddenly starts to withdraw, they no longer want to hang out. They don't want to receive phone calls. They start isolating. They start sleeping too much. They start abusing drugs or alcohol in a way that they weren't before. It's something to pay attention to. Be involved in providing access to them for mental health care and being proactive about mental health, both in them and in you. That's one of the reasons why this channel exists, is to be a resource. So if you wouldn't mind at some point, share this with people so that they could be aware of it. There should not be a stigma to anyone or anything about speaking up and talking about it. Seek out support from your mental or from your healthcare providers. Not your mental health care provider, but your health care provider. What I'm finding is that more and more physicians are noticing that there is a very serious problem, and they are beginning to be more and more open to referring people to where they can find some mental help. This is important. Engage with cultural and religious beliefs that encourage connecting and help seeking, discourage suicidal behavior, or create a strong sense of purpose or self-esteem. When we started Mental Health Moments, one of the things that we said we wanted to do with this channel is to bring together the spiritual, the practical, and the mental. I'm sure at that time some people were wondering, is that possible? How will that look? This is what it looks like. We bring together the spiritual, the practical, and the mental. This is a perfect opportunity for us to remember that this is what this is all about. Find a community of people that speak life, that believe in life, that encourage you to live, that will be there for you when you're down. They encourage you to take your next step, all of those things. Actively engage with people and groups that encourage you along the way. And lastly, if someone you care about has completed the act, there are several things that you should actively consider. Number one of the most important is forgiveness. Forgive them. Sometimes I find as I talk to people that they still hold that. They're still hurt. I know we don't understand, and we could probably never understand why the person chose that particular way and all of that. But listen, find it in your heart to forgive them. Realize that they were probably at a place that they just couldn't bear with it, couldn't deal with it much anymore. And so just number one, find a way in your heart to be able to forgive them. For yourself, see someone. Listen. Seek out a friend, a counselor, a pastor, a therapist, someone that you can trust, someone that you can talk to who will listen and hear what you're saying. Do this. Don't self-medicate. That should go without saying, but unfortunately it does not. Don't self-medicate. So many times we find people that are dealing with this and they just began their own process of they're drinking a little bit more or they're taking a little bit more of their prescription medications. Don't self-medicate and listen, do this. Don't tell yourself that you're all right. Sometimes we try to convince ourselves that we're all right when we're actually not. And what we need to do is find some help. There is so much more that I would love to talk to you about on this subject, but this is a start. What are your thoughts? Has anything been said in these last 2 weeks that has been helpful to you? Has anything been said tonight that you can take out as a thought? And I'll ask again, as I did in the first podcast together, would you like to share your thoughts? And if you would, drop them in the comments. Anything that you think of that might be helpful, that might help someone along their way, definitely take the time to think about it and put it down. And if you don't want to share it publicly, my contact information will be there in just a moment, and you can share that with us, and we'll get back to you. And what about you? Is there anything else that you would like to hear on this subject? If you would, put that in the comments. We're happy to address this as we did last week. We will continue to post the hotline, the suicide prevention hotline. They've shortened it down to 988. If you have any thoughts or if you know of anyone that's dealing with these kinds of issues, pick up that phone and dial 988, and I promise you someone will be there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to hear what you have to say. We will also be providing some links throughout the week, some links at the end of this video and some links throughout the week that will be helpful. And again, if you have anything that you would like to hear a little bit more of, please be free to put that in the comments. If you are not a part of our mental health page on Facebook, please join that. We'll put that graphic up. And if you haven't yet, become a subscriber and push the notification button here on YouTube. Please do that so that you can get the notification whenever we launch a new video. We do every Sunday night at 7 o'clock. We're glad you found us. We hope that something that we're saying is helpful. We look forward to seeing you next time right here on Mental Health Moments.